Jake thought getting a roommate would be simple. He posted on the university bulletin board, met a few people, and picked someone who seemed normal enough. What he didn't know was that his new roommate had some very interesting ideas about how Americans lived. Her name was Zara, and she came from a small town so far away that most people had never heard of it. She seemed nice enough when they first met. She was polite, quiet, and promised to keep the apartment clean. Jake figured he'd lucked out with such a respectful roommate. The first day went smoothly. Zara moved in with just 2 suitcases and a backpack full of books. She spent most of her time reading and taking notes in a small leather journal. Jake assumed she was just a serious student, which was fine by him. He had his own studies to worry about. But on the second night, things got weird. Jake had always been a night owl. He liked staying up late working on assignments, then grabbing a snack before bed. That Tuesday night was no different. He finished his essay around midnight, saved his work, and headed to the kitchen for his usual glass of water and maybe some leftover pizza. He was wearing his favorite pajama set, a soft blue shirt and matching pants his mom had bought him for Christmas. Nothing fancy, just comfortable clothes for sleeping. As he walked down the hallway, he could see the light on in the kitchen. Zara was probably studying late too. When he entered the kitchen, he found Zara sitting at the small dining table with her laptop open and several thick books spread around her. She looked up when he walked in, and her expression changed from focused to confused. She stared at him for a long moment, then looked down at one of her books, then back at him. "Excuse me," she said in her careful, formal way of speaking. "I have a question about human behavior." Jake paused with the water glass halfway to his lips. "Human behavior?" Zara nodded seriously and picked up one of her books. It looked old and worn, with yellowed pages and a faded cover. "According to my research materials, humans naturally sleep without clothing. This allows for better temperature control and follows natural biological patterns." Jake nearly spit out his water. "What?" "The documentation is very clear," Zara continued, flipping through pages covered in highlighting and sticky notes. Chapter 7 explains how artificial textile barriers during rest periods can disrupt natural cooling processes. Yet you are, wearing? She gestured at his pajamas. Many layers of fabric. Jake set down his glass and tried to process what was happening. His roommate was sitting in their kitchen at midnight, consulting what looked like a textbook from the 1970s, questioning his choice to wear pajamas. This was not how he'd imagined college going. "Zara," he said slowly, "where exactly did you get this information?" She held up the book proudly. "My grandmother's anthropology collection. She studied human cultures for many years. These are her research materials about American customs and behaviors." Jake leaned closer to look at the cover. The title was barely readable, but he could make out something about cultural patterns in modern society, and a publication date from 1973. The pages were filled with academic language and what appeared to be field notes from decades ago. "This is really old," Jake pointed out. "Things have changed a lot since the 70s, but Zara shook her head firmly. "Human biology doesn't change in 50 years. If this was the optimal sleeping method, then it should still be optimal now. Unless..." She paused and grabbed her small journal, scribbling something down. "Unless there have been evolutionary adaptations I haven't accounted for." Jake rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache coming on. "Look, some people might sleep without clothes, but it's not a rule or anything. Most people wear something comfortable to bed, like pajamas. It's just personal preference." Zara wrote this down too, underlining certain words. Personal preference over biological optimization. Interesting. This suggests cultural conditioning may override natural instincts. "It's not cultural conditioning," Jake said, getting a little frustrated. "It's just what people are comfortable with, and it's definitely not something roommates usually discuss with each other." "Why not?" Zara asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "Roommates share living space. Understanding each other's behaviors seems logical for creating a harmonious environment." Jake realized he was having a very surreal conversation. Here he was, standing in his own kitchen in his pajamas, being questioned about human sleeping habits by someone treating him like a research subject. And the weirdest part was that Zara seemed completely serious about the whole thing. It's just private, he tried to explain. People don't usually talk about what they wear to bed. It's personal. Zara nodded thoughtfully and made more notes. Privacy taboos around sleeping attire. This wasn't mentioned in the literature. She looked up at him with the intense focus of a scientist who had just discovered something fascinating. You may be providing data on cultural variations that weren't documented in my grandmother's research. The way she said it made Jake feel like a bug under a microscope. I'm not providing data. I'm just trying to get some water and go to bed. Of course, Zara said quickly. Please don't let me interrupt your natural evening routine. I'll just observe from a respectful distance. Observe what exactly? Your behavioral patterns, to see if they align with documented human norms or represent regional variations. Jake stared at her for a moment, then decided this conversation had gone on long enough. Zara, please don't observe my behavioral patterns. Just, let's both go to bed and pretend this conversation never happened. He grabbed his water and headed toward his room, but he could feel her watching him the whole way. As he closed his door, he heard the sound of her pen scratching in her journal. Jake lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. His roommate thought she was conducting some kind of anthropological study, and apparently he was her main test subject. This was definitely not covered in the roommate agreement they'd signed. He could hear Zara moving around in her room, and at one point, he was pretty sure he heard her talking to herself, probably recording notes about their conversation. The thought made him pull his blanket up higher, suddenly very aware that someone was analyzing his every move. Tomorrow, he decided, he would have a proper talk with Zara about boundaries and normal roommate behavior. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, studious roommate was going to make his life a lot more complicated than he'd bargained for. Jake thought the weird conversation about sleeping habits would be a one-time thing. He was wrong. Very wrong. Over the next week, Zara turned into some kind of detective, except instead of solving crimes, she was trying to solve the mystery of how humans really behaved at night. And Jake was her main suspect. It started small. On Wednesday morning, Jake noticed Zara watching him extra carefully when he came out of his room. She had her little journal ready and was writing down notes as he walked to the bathroom. When he asked what she was doing, she just smiled and said she was documenting morning transition behaviors. Thursday was worse. Jake woke up around 2 a.m. to get some water, and he could swear he saw Zara's door crack open slightly as he walked down the hall. When he looked directly at it, the door quickly closed. He stood there for a minute, wondering if he was imagining things, but he could see a thin line of light under her door and hear the scratch of a pen on paper. By Friday, Jake was starting to feel like he lived in a science experiment instead of an apartment. Zara, he said that morning over breakfast, are you watching me? She looked up from her cereal, spoon halfway to her mouth. Define watching. Following me around. Taking notes about what I do. Staring at me. Zara considered this carefully. I prefer the term observational research. And I'm not staring. Staring implies rudeness. I'm simply collecting data on natural human behaviors in their native environment. Jake put his head in his hands. This is my apartment, not a zoo. Exactly, Zara said, getting excited. You're behaving naturally because you don't think you're being studied. This gives me much more accurate data than any controlled laboratory setting could provide. The weekend brought new problems. Jake's girlfriend, Maya, was coming over on Saturday to study for their chemistry exam. He was nervous about introducing her to Zara, especially given his roommate's recent obsession with human behavior research. He probably should have warned Maya ahead of time. Maya arrived around noon with her textbooks and a bag of snacks. She was her usual cheerful self, greeting Jake with a quick hug and asking about his week. Everything was normal until Zara appeared in the living room with her clipboard. Hello, Zara said formally. You must be Maya. I've heard Jake mention you several times during his evening phone conversations. Jake froze. He hadn't realized Zara was listening to his phone calls. Maya smiled politely. Nice to meet you. Jake's told me about you too. Perfect. Zara said, clicking her pen. I have some questions about human pair bonding behaviors if you don't mind participating in a brief survey. Jake tried to interrupt, but Maya was already curious. What kind of survey? Zara flipped through her clipboard. Pages. I'm researching discrepancies between documented human behaviors and observed reality. For instance, do you and Jake follow traditional sleeping arrangement protocols? Maya looked confused. Sleeping arrangements? Yes. The literature suggests that human mating pairs typically share sleeping spaces and follow natural temperature regulation practices. However, Jake appears to deviate significantly from these patterns. Jake felt his face turn red. Zara, we talked about this, but Maya was laughing. Is this for a psychology class? That's so cool. Yeah, most couples do sleep together eventually, but Jake and I aren't living together or anything. We're just dating. Zara scribbled furiously. Dating. A preliminary bonding phase before permanent pair establishment. And during this phase, do you maintain separate sleeping territories? Well, yeah, Maya said, still thinking this was some kind of school project. Most people don't move in together right away, and when couples do sleep over, they usually wear comfortable clothes, like pajamas or t-shirts. Zara stopped writing and looked up sharply. Comfortable clothes? Not optimal biological conditions? What? Do you mean optimal biological conditions? Jake jumped in quickly. She means nothing, let's go study in my room. But it was too late. Zara was already pulling out one of her grandmother's old books. According to my research materials, humans achieve better rest through natural temperature regulation, which requires removing artificial textile barriers. Maya's eyes widened as she understood what Zara was really asking about. Oh. No, that's really not how most people do things. But the documentation clearly states, Zara, Jake said firmly. Maya and I need to study now. Can you please do your research somewhere else? Zara looked disappointed but nodded. Of course. I'll just make a note that cultural practices appear to have shifted significantly since the 1970s. After Zara left, Maya turned to Jake with raised eyebrows. Your roommate is asking people about their sleeping habits? Jake groaned. She found her grandmother's old anthropology books and thinks she's conducting legitimate research. She's been watching me all week to see if I follow proper human behaviors. Maya started laughing again. That's actually kind of sweet. She's trying to understand American culture through 50-year-old textbooks. It's not sweet when she's spying on me through her door crack at 2 a.m. She's doing what? Jake explained the whole situation. The late-night observations, the constant note-taking, the scientific charts he'd started finding around the apartment. By the time he finished, Maya was torn between amusement and concern. She's treating. You like a research subject, Maya said. That's gotta be weird. Weird doesn't begin to cover it. Yesterday I found a chart in the bathroom titled, Jake's Observed Sleep Patterns versus Expected Human Norms. She had my bedtime, wake-up time, and bathroom visits all plotted on a graph. Maya shook her head. You need to talk to her about boundaries. I've tried. She just takes notes about my resistance to behavioral documentation. They managed to study for a few hours, but Jake kept noticing Zara walking past his room more often than usual. Each time he could hear the faint scratch of her pen in that journal. When Maya got up to use the bathroom, she came back with an amused expression. Jake, she said quietly, there's a new chart on the mirror. It's about pair bonding study, session behaviors. She's got our study time, how often we talk versus read, and something called proximity maintenance patterns. Jake buried his face in his chemistry textbook. I'm going to have to find a new roommate, aren't I? Maya patted his shoulder sympathetically. Or you could just help her understand that real human behavior is different from what's in those old books. But Jake wasn't sure Zara would listen. She seemed pretty convinced that her grandmother's research was more accurate than what actual humans were telling her. And unfortunately, he was starting to suspect that her observational research was about to get even more intense. He was right. That night, he found a schedule taped to his bedroom door titled Proposed Behavioral Study Week. According to the chart, Zara wanted to implement controlled testing conditions to see if Americans could adapt to proper human sleeping protocols. Jake stared at the schedule and realized his roommate problems were just getting started. Jake had hoped things would calm down after the weekend, but Monday brought a whole new level of crazy. When he got home from classes, he found Zara setting up what looked like a presentation in their living room. She had moved the coffee table to face the couch, set up her laptop, and arranged several thick books in neat piles around the room. There were printed charts taped to the walls, graphs spread across every surface, and what appeared to be a slideshow ready to go on her computer screen. "Jake," she said when he walked in. "Perfect timing. I need to present my findings to you." Jake dropped his backpack by the door and stared at the scene. "Zara, what is all this?" "My research presentation. I've spent the weekend analyzing all the data I've collected, and I've reached some important conclusions about the discrepancies between documented human behavior and what I've observed in this household." Jake noticed she was wearing what looked like her most formal clothes, a button-up shirt and dress pants, like she was giving a presentation to a board of directors instead of talking to her roommate in their living room. "I really don't think this is necessary," Jake said, but Zara was already clicking through to her first slide. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the couch like he was attending a business meeting. "This will only take about 20 minutes. Jake reluctantly sat down, wondering how his life had become so weird. Zara clicked to her title slide, which read, "Human Sleeping Behaviors, a Comparative Analysis of Literature versus Observed Reality." "As you know," Zara began in a formal presentation voice, "I've been conducting observational research on human nighttime behaviors in their natural habitat, this apartment. My initial hypothesis was that documented optimal human sleeping conditions would match observed behaviors. However, my data suggests otherwise." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a chart comparing expected behaviors and Jake's behaviors. The expected column was filled with things like natural temperature regulation and unimpeded biological processes. Jake's column had textile barriers and cultural conditioning effects. "This is insane," Jake muttered, but Zara was already moving to her next point. "Furthermore," she continued, "my interview with your mating pair, Maya, revealed that these deviations from optimal behavior are widespread among your peer group. This suggests that an entire generation of humans has been culturally programmed to ignore their biological needs." Jake rubbed his temples. "Maya is my girlfriend, not my mating pair. And we're not ignoring biological needs. We're just wearing comfortable clothes to sleep." Zara made a note on her paper. "Subject continues to defend suboptimal behaviors despite presentation of scientific evidence." She looked back up at him. "Which brings me to my proposed solution." She clicked to a new slide that made Jake's heart sink. The title read, "Controlled Experiment, Optimal Human Sleeping Conditions." "I propose a 1-week study," Zara announced, "during which both household occupants follow documented optimal human sleeping protocols. This will allow us to measure the effects of proper temperature regulation on sleep quality, morning alertness, and overall biological function." Jake stared at the slide, which included a detailed schedule, measurement criteria, and what looked like consent forms. "Are you seriously asking me to sleep without clothes for a week so you can take notes about it?" "Not just notes," Zara said excitedly, clicking to show more charts. "I'll monitor temperature variations, sleep duration, REM, cycle quality, and morning cognitive function. We'll have quantifiable data to prove whether the documented methods are superior to current cultural practices." "Absolutely not," Jake said, standing up from the couch. But Zara wasn't giving up easily. She clicked to another slide showing temperature, graphs, and scientific articles. "Look at this data about human thermoregulation during sleep cycles. The research clearly shows that artificial heating and textile barriers disrupt natural cooling processes, leading to poor sleep quality and reduced cognitive performance." She had clearly spent hours preparing this presentation. There were charts showing optimal room temperatures, graphs comparing sleep quality with and without pajamas, and even what appeared to be excerpts from medical journals about circadian rhythms. "The science is very clear," Zara continued, warming up to her topic. "Your current sleeping methods are literally preventing your body from achieving optimal rest. Don't you want to improve your academic performance through better sleep?" "Jake." had to admit that some of her research looked legitimate, even if her conclusions were completely crazy. Zara, even if that stuff is true, I'm not conducting sleep experiments with my roommate. That's just weird. Weird according to cultural conditioning, Zara said, making more notes. But objectively, what's weird about following scientifically proven methods for better health? She clicked to yet another slide, this one showing a detailed experimental protocol. She had thought of everything: privacy measures, data collection methods, even a system for measuring their sleep quality through the week. I've prepared consent forms, she said, pulling out official-looking documents, and privacy protocols, to ensure the study remains professional and scientific. We would each maintain our own data collection, with no direct observation between subjects. Jake looked at the consent forms, which were surprisingly detailed, and actually did address privacy concerns. It was clear that Zara had put serious thought into this, treating it like a real scientific study rather than just a weird roommate situation. This is crazy, Jake said again, but he found himself actually reading through her research. Some of the temperature regulation stuff did make sense from a scientific perspective. I understand your hesitation, Zara said, sitting down across from him with a more personal tone. Cultural taboos are powerful psychological barriers. But consider this. What if the research is correct? What if you could improve your sleep quality, academic performance, and overall health just by following natural human biological patterns? She pulled out her grandmother's book again, showing him highlighted passages about sleep research and human biology. My grandmother spent decades studying human behavior patterns. This isn't just random information, it's documented scientific research. Jake flipped through some of the pages, noting that while the book was old, much of the biological information seemed legitimate. The problem was Zara's interpretation of how to apply it. Even if this research is accurate, Jake said carefully, that doesn't mean roommates should be conducting experiments together. This is the kind of thing people might try privately, not as a shared project. Zara looked disappointed but nodded thoughtfully. I see. Cultural privacy norms extend to health improvement activities. This wasn't covered in the literature. Right. And also, most people would probably want to research this more before trying it. Maybe talk to a doctor or sleep specialist. A medical consultation phase, Zara said, brightening up and making notes. That's actually excellent methodology. We should establish baseline measurements from health professionals before beginning any experimental protocols. Jake realized he might have accidentally encouraged her rather than shut down the idea. Zara, I'm not saying we should do this study. I'm saying that if someone wanted to try these sleep methods, they would do it privately and carefully. But Zara was already back to her charts, muttering about proper experimental controls and medical oversight protocols. Jake watched her rearrange her research materials and realized that his roommate's scientific curiosity was probably not going away anytime soon. Look, he said finally, I appreciate all the work you put into this presentation, but I'm not comfortable being part of a sleep study. Can we just agree to drop this whole thing? Zara looked up from her papers with the expression of a scientist whose important research had just been rejected. I understand your position, she said formally. However, I should mention that I've already begun the preliminary phase of the study myself. Jake felt a chill of dread. What do you mean, preliminary phase? Zara smiled proudly. I started implementing the optimal sleeping protocols 3 days ago to establish baseline data. The results have been quite encouraging so far. Jake woke up Tuesday morning with a sense of dread in his stomach. After Zara's comment about already starting her preliminary phase, he'd barely slept. Every sound from her room had made him wonder what kind of data she was collecting about his sleeping habits. He got out of bed around 7 and shuffled toward the bathroom, still half asleep. As he reached for the door handle, it suddenly opened from the inside. There stood Zara, fresh out of the shower, with a towel wrapped around her and her hair dripping wet. For a split second, they just stared at each other in complete shock. Good morning, Jake, she said cheerfully, as if running into your roommate outside the bathroom was the most normal thing in the world. I can already report significant improvements in sleep quality metrics from implementing proper protocols. Jake's brain took a moment to catch up with what was happening. "Zara, we need to talk." "Certainly," she said, adjusting her towel. "I have fascinating data to share. My sleep tracking app shows a 15% improvement in deep sleep cycles, and my morning alertness levels are notably higher." "Not about your sleep data," Jake said quickly. "About all of this. The research, the watching, the experiments. We need to set some rules." Zara tilted her head, genuinely confused. "Rules about scientific methodology?" "Rules about being roommates," Jake said firmly. "Real rules. About privacy and boundaries and normal human behavior." An hour later, they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and what had turned into a very serious conversation. Jake had finally managed to explain that regardless of what her grandmother's book said, most Americans had strong feelings about personal space and privacy. "So when you say boundaries," Zara said, taking careful notes, "you mean invisible social barriers that shouldn't be crossed without permission?" "Exactly," Jake said, relieved that she seemed to be understanding. "Like not watching someone through door cracks, not making charts about their bathroom habits, and definitely not conducting experiments on them without asking." Zara looked genuinely embarrassed for the first time since he'd known her. "I wasn't conducting experiments on you. I was conducting experiments near you. I thought that was different." "It's not different," Jake said gently. "When you live with someone, you need their permission before you start studying their behavior." Zara put down her pen and looked at her pile of research materials. "I think I may have misunderstood several important cultural concepts." "What do you mean?" She pulled out her grandmother's book and flipped to a page covered in highlighter marks. "This chapter talks about participant observation in anthropological research. I thought it meant I should observe participants, you, in their natural environment. But you're saying that's wrong?" Jake leaned over to look at the page. The text was dense academic language about research methods and fieldwork techniques. "Zara, this is about professional anthropologists studying cultures they don't belong to, usually with permission and official approval. You can't just decide to study your roommate like they're part of an undiscovered tribe." "Oh," Zara said quietly. "I see the problem now." She started flipping through more pages, pointing out sections she'd highlighted about observational research and cultural documentation. Jake realized that she'd been trying to follow legitimate scientific methods, but she'd completely misunderstood the context. "Your grandmother was probably studying communities that agreed to be studied," Jake explained. "And she was doing it as professional research, not as someone's roommate." Zara nodded slowly, making notes about the difference between professional research and personal relationships. "So when I moved in here, I should have asked if you wanted to be part of a cultural study." "You shouldn't have been doing a cultural study at all," Jake said. "You should have just been learning how to be a good roommate." This seemed to be a completely new concept for Zara. But how do you learn cultural norms without systematic observation and data collection? Jake thought about this. Most people just ask questions, or watch how others behave in public, or make friends who can explain things to them. "Ask questions," Zara repeated, writing this down. "That's much more efficient than covert observation." "And less creepy," Jake added. "Less creepy," she wrote. Important cultural note. They spent the next hour going through Zara's research materials, with Jake explaining which behaviors she'd observed were normal, and which were just specific to him. She seemed fascinated to learn that not all Americans had the same daily routines, sleeping schedules, or food preferences. So when the book says Americans typically eat breakfast at 7 a.m., Zara said, that doesn't mean you're culturally deviant for eating at 8:30, right? People have different schedules based on their work, classes, and personal preferences. Zara made a big note about individual variation within cultural groups. This explains why my observations didn't match the documented patterns. I was expecting uniformity when I should have expected diversity. Jake was starting to understand why Zara had been so confused. Her grandmother's books described cultural patterns in very general terms, without explaining that real people don't always fit neat categories. "What about the sleeping research?" Zara asked hesitantly. Was that completely wrong too? Jake considered this carefully. The science might be legitimate, but the way you were trying to study it was inappropriate. If someone wanted to try different sleeping methods, they would research it privately and maybe talk to a doctor first. Private research, Zara said, making another note. No roommate involvement required. Exactly. Zara looked through her charts and graphs about optimal sleeping conditions. I suppose I got excited about the potential for improved health outcomes and didn't consider social appropriateness. That's actually kind of sweet, Jake admitted. You were trying to help even if you went about it the wrong way. She smiled for the first time during their conversation. I did want to help. The research suggested that proper sleeping conditions could improve your academic performance. I thought you would want to optimize your biological functions for better grades. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Most people don't think about optimizing their biological functions. They just try to get enough sleep and eat decent food. How wonderfully simple, Zara said, sounding almost envious. My approach was unnecessarily complicated. By the end of their talk, Zara had filled several pages with notes about appropriate roommate behavior, cultural privacy norms, and the difference between scientific research and everyday social interaction. She seemed genuinely relieved to have clear guidelines instead of trying to figure everything out through observation. So to summarize, she said, reading from her notes, good roommates respect privacy, ask permission before studying each other, keep personal habits private, and communicate directly about household issues. That's a pretty good summary, Jake agreed. And if I want to understand American culture better, I should ask questions instead of conducting covert research? Definitely. Zara closed her notebook and gathered up her research materials. I owe you an apology, Jake. I treated you like a research subject instead of a person. That was inappropriate and probably uncomfortable for you. Jake felt a wave of relief. Apology accepted, and for what it's worth, I can tell you were trying to be scientific about it. You just needed better methodology. Better methodology, Zara repeated with a small smile. Perhaps next time I'm curious about cultural practices, I'll try asking you directly instead of charting your bathroom schedule. That would be much appreciated, Jake said, laughing despite himself. As Zara carried her research materials back to her room, Jake felt like they'd finally made real progress. Maybe having a roommate who approached everything like a science experiment wouldn't be so bad, as long as she remembered that he was a person, not a research project. He was wrong about one thing, though. Zara's scientific curiosity wasn't completely satisfied yet, but at least now she knew how to channel it in more appropriate directions. 2 weeks after their big conversation about boundaries, Jake was starting to think life with Zara might actually work out. She had stopped making charts about his daily habits, quit sneaking around with her notebook, and generally seemed to be settling into normal roommate behavior. But he should have known that Zara's curiosity about American culture wouldn't just disappear overnight. It started again on a Friday evening when Maya came over with pizza and the suggestion that they all hang out together. Jake had been worried about how Maya and Zara would get along after that awkward first meeting, but Maya seemed genuinely interested in getting to know his unusual roommate better. So Zara, Maya said as they sat around the living room with their pizza, Jake told me you're from a really small town. What's it like there compared to here? Zara brightened up immediately. She loved talking about her hometown, and Jake realized he'd never actually asked her much about her background. As she described the tiny mountain community where she grew up, he began to understand why American culture seemed so foreign to her. We have about 300 people total, Zara explained. Everyone knows everyone, and most families have lived there for generations. When I told people I was coming to study in America, they acted like I was traveling to another planet. It must be a huge adjustment, Maya said sympathetically. The biggest challenge has been understanding social rules that aren't written down anywhere, Zara admitted. In my town, if you want to know something about someone, you just ask them directly. Here, there seem to be invisible guidelines about what you can and can't ask about. Jake felt a little guilty. He'd been so focused on stopping Zara's research project that he hadn't thought about how confusing everything must be for her. What kind of things are you curious about? Maya asked. Zara glanced at Jake nervously, then pulled out a small notebook. Not her research journal, just a regular notebook with questions written in it. I have a list of things I don't understand about American college culture. Like what? Maya encouraged her. Well, Zara said, flipping through pages, when people say we should hang out sometime, do they actually mean it? Because I've heard at least 12 people say this to me, but none of them have followed up with specific plans. Maya burst out laughing. Oh, that's just something people say to be polite. It doesn't usually mean they actually want to make plans. Zara wrote this down immediately. So it's a social politeness ritual, not a genuine invitation? Exactly. If someone really wants to hang out, they'll suggest a specific time and place. Jake watched Zara take notes and realized this was completely different from her creepy research behavior. She was just asking normal questions about things that confused her. What else is on your list, he asked. Zara looked pleased that he was interested. Why do people in the dining hall sit with empty chairs between groups? Is there a territory system I don't understand? It's just personal space, Maya explained. Americans like having a little bubble of space around them, especially when they're eating. But in my town, if there's an empty seat at someone's table, you just sit down and join the conversation. Is that not acceptable here? Jake thought about this. It depends on the situation. In the dining hall, people usually sit with their friends. But if someone looks lonely or you know them a little bit, it's okay to ask if you can join them. Zara made more notes. Ask permission before joining. Don't assume empty seats are available. They spent the next hour going through Zara's list of cultural questions. Some of them were hilarious, like why Americans seem to have strong opinions about pineapple on pizza or why people said, "How are you?" but didn't seem to want detailed answers. Others were more thoughtful observations about social hierarchies, dating customs, and unwritten rules about personal space. This is actually really interesting, Maya said, as Zara explained her confusion about American dating practices. I never thought about how weird some of our social rules must seem to someone from outside. Everything here is so indirect, Zara said. In my culture, if you like someone, you tell them. If you disagree with something, you say so. If you need help, you ask directly. Here, there are layers of meaning behind everything people say. Jake was starting to realize that Zara's scientific approach to understanding culture made more sense than he'd initially thought. She wasn't being weird on purpose, she was trying to decode a completely foreign social system. Okay, my turn, Maya said. I want to know about your hometown. What would seem weird to you about how Americans behave? Zara perked up at this. Oh, so many things, the obsession with privacy for one. In my town, everyone knows what everyone else is doing, and that's considered normal and caring. Here, people seem to guard information about themselves like it's classified. Like when you were trying to research Jake's sleeping habits, Maya asked with a grin. Zara looked embarrassed. That was a perfect example of cultural misunderstanding. In my community, sharing information about daily routines and health practices is how neighbors look out for each other. I didn't realize that Americans consider those things private. What else seems strange to you? Jake asked, genuinely curious. Now, the way people eat alone, Zara said immediately. I see students in the dining hall sitting by themselves looking at their phones and nobody talks to them. In my town, eating alone would be considered sad. Someone would always invite you to join their table. Maya and Jake exchanged a look. They'd both eaten alone plenty of times without thinking anything of it. Also, Zara continued, warming up to the topic, the way people here seem to worry constantly about bothering others. I've seen students struggle with heavy doors or drop their books, and people nearby pretend not to notice because they don't want to interfere. In my culture, not helping someone who obviously needs assistance would be considered rude, Jake thought about this. I guess we're taught not to assume people want help unless they ask for it. But how can someone ask for help if the social rules say you shouldn't bother strangers? Zara asked. It seems like a system designed to keep people isolated. Maya nodded thoughtfully. She has a point. I've definitely pretended not to see people struggling because I didn't want to seem pushy. As the evening went on, their conversation turned into a genuine cultural exchange. Zara told them about community traditions from her hometown, how neighbors shared resources without being asked, how decisions were made collectively, and how privacy was considered less important than community support. In return, Jake and Maya explained some of the reasoning behind American social customs, how the emphasis on privacy came from valuing individual choice, how politeness rituals helped people interact without conflict, and how the focus on personal space was meant to respect everyone's comfort levels. I think I understand better now, Zara said as they cleaned up the pizza boxes. American culture prioritizes individual autonomy over community integration. That's why my direct approach to learning about people seemed invasive. I was treating you like we were already part of the same community. That's a really good way to put it, Maya said. And I think I understand why you were so confused about everything. Your cultural background emphasizes sharing and openness, so American privacy customs probably seemed unnecessarily secretive. Jake felt like something had shifted in their dynamic. Instead of seeing Zara as his weird roommate who didn't understand normal behavior, he was beginning to appreciate her different perspective on social interaction. You know, he said, some of your cultural practices actually sound pretty nice. It would be cool if people were more willing to help each other out or include others in conversations. Zara smiled. And some American customs make sense too. I can see how having personal boundaries would make people feel more comfortable in a diverse environment where everyone has different backgrounds and preferences. As Maya got ready to leave, she turned to Zara with a grin. Next time you have questions about American culture, just ask us directly. It's much more fun than trying to figure it out through research. Ask directly, Zara repeated, making a final note in her notebook. I'm starting to think that might be the most important rule I've learned. After Maya left, Jake and Zara settled into what felt like the most normal roommate evening they'd had since she moved in. They watched a movie together, with Zara asking occasional questions about cultural references she didn't understand, and Jake explaining them without feeling like he was being studied. Jake, Zara said during the credits, thank you for being patient with me while I figured out how to be a good roommate. Thank you for teaching me to think about why we do the things we do, Jake replied. I never realized how many of our social rules are just arbitrary customs. As they both headed to their rooms for the night, Jake felt like they'd finally found the right balance. Zara could satisfy her curiosity about American culture through conversation and questions, and he could learn about different ways of thinking about community and social interaction. It wasn't the quiet, predictable roommate situation he'd originally wanted, but it was turning out to be much more interesting.